Welcome to a special end of the semester event with the Schwalb Center for Israel and Jewish Studies, located at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I'm Jeannette Gabriel, the director of the Schwalb Center, and I'm very pleased tonight to have a presentation with student Tristan Newman speaking on saving the holy middle ground, reimagining the future of conservative Judaism. Before I introduce Tristan, I just want to explain how the event tonight is going to go. Tristan is going to give a presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will open it up to Q&A from the group. I would encourage you to enter your questions into chat, and you'll have an opportunity to vocalize some of those comments at the end of the presentation. Tristan Newman is a senior at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, earning degrees in religious studies and history. He is the past president of J-Connect Nebraska, an organization that seeks to provide for the communal and spiritual needs of college-age Jews. In his time at Nebraska, he has been involved in various multicultural and interfaith projects representing the Jewish community. In his previous work for the Schwalb Center for Israel and Judaic Studies, Tristan presented his dissertation, Zionism for Generation Z, drawing from Jewish ethics, which you can watch on the Schwalb Center website. After his History of Zionism independent study that we did together. Previously, Tristan completed his undergraduate fellowship in the Nachshon Project, which is a legacy heritage fund opportunity for young Jews inspired to serve the Jewish community. After his fellowship training, he completed a campus project for the university and a camp project for Camp Vermont in Wisconsin. Recently, Tristan returned from Arizona, where he was an education intern at Valley Beit Midrash. He is now serving as Bethel Synagogue Interim Youth Director. Respective of his position at Bethel, Tristan is interning with Rabbi Stephen Abraham. After graduation, he hopes to attend the year program at the Partridge Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. His goal is to attend rabbinical school concurrent with an MSW program at Columbia University. Lastly, he volunteers as a staff member for Launch Leadership and the Autism Society of Nebraska. I want to say what a pleasure it has been to work with Tristan here at the Schwalb Center over the past few years, and how proud we are of the incredible gains he has made as a student and the type of leadership potential that he shows for the future, not just of the Jewish community, but beyond that in terms of being an important religious scholar. I do want to mention that in addition to this presentation, Tristan is going to be doing a series of additional lectures that you will be able to watch on the Schwalb Center website in the upcoming weeks. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Tristan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gabriel. I want to thank the Schwalb Center for providing me this opportunity to present my thesis on the future of conservative Judaism tonight. Before I begin, I want to give my sincerest thanks to Dr. Jeannette Gabriel, the director of the Schwalb Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. This past fall semester, I completed an independent study with Dr. Gabriel about European Jewish philosophy. What I appreciated most about this study was the opportunity for me to dive into the traditional dogma of the early conservative movement. Our study allowed me to juxtapose the founding ideology, sometimes called the ideology of ambiguity, with the hardened values that came out of 1988 when Rabbi Robert Gordis authored the movement Statement of Principles called Emet Ve'emunah to solidify the stances of the growing Jewish middle. My presentation tonight focuses on how conservative Judaism is at a crossroads, and it needs to decide whether or not it is ready to change for the next generation. Thank you, Dr. Gabriel, for guiding me in this study. Additionally, I would like to extend my gratitude to my teachers at the Nachshon Project, who have worked with me extensively on my professional development in Jewish textual analysis skills. Lastly, I find it important to thank my teacher, Rabbi Stephen Abraham, for kickstarting my study of conservative Judaism. And before I dive into the history, the cornerstones, problems, and competing visions of conservative Judaism, I want to talk about what has brought me to this presentation tonight. Why do I feel impelled to speak on such a niche topic that some might argue is the broken record within Jewish discourse? Why am I choosing, out of all of the possible topics for a senior presentation, to focus on the weak-kneed middle child of Jewish denominations? Let me give you some background. I was 16 years old when I first decided to embrace Jewish living. By chance, because of a few influential friends, I found myself at a conservative synagogue involved in Bilu and EMSA region USY. USY, which is the high school youth organization of the conservative movement, was able to create a space for me in which I, someone who knew next to nothing about Judaism or my Jewish identity, could be part of the same experiences as zealous and observant Jewish teens. The space, the community, was there for Jews across the spectrum of practice. It did not matter whether or not you knew how to daven all the Shabbat prayers or participate in Tish, and it did not matter whether or not you could read Hebrew or perhaps wanted a less traditional prayer experience. USY showed me that a container can be built between the ends of the very observant and the less traditional, the secular, to unify the Jewish people. Everyone there, including me, was on their own journey to figure out what their Judaism meant to them. Well, I like to tell people that I started becoming observant and fell in love with Judaism through engaging in Talmud Torah, deep thinking, and engaging in learning how to pray, which is true. The embrace of my community, both those who lived like me and differently from me, is where I finally felt Judaism loved me back. I walked out of USY, my experiences at Bethel, yearning to do more, to understand more, to be a Jew who lives with meaning without shutting myself out from the larger world. This brings me to the start of my pitch. Why I believe, based on the 2020 data on Jewish Americans, that the framework of conservative Judaism can revitalize the latent yearning spirit of millions of disengaged Jews. I understand this might not seem like the best option. Nationally, 8% of Jewish Americans under 30 identify with the conservative movement, as compared with 25% of Jews 65 and older. Ranking higher than the conservative movement, Reform Judaism makes up the largest share at 29% affiliation for those under 30. Orthodox Judaism ranks at 17% and is growing exponentially. The greatest chunk of the data are the Jewish Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, who might say that they're just Jewish or not religious, which comes out to an astounding 41%. The trend we have here is really interesting because the growth is occurring in two opposite ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, Orthodox Judaism is growing because of high fertility rates, intense rigor it can offer young people who feel they might need something really serious or authentic if they want to claim religion. Everyone here is Orthodox and thinks that it is the most correct form or the most original form of Judaism. So that should be the path that they actually want to be religious. But we'll get to that later in the presentation tonight. On the other hand, Jewish nuns, or the Jews of no religion, are increasing in even greater amounts, with 67% of all Jews saying that religion is not appealing to them. This may be alarming, but this does not mean that the Jewish future is at an end. Rather, it seems more likely that the current institutions that serve the Jewish people are on the verge of being transformed. The data acknowledges that, quote, do-it-yourself religious observances are directly substituting for synagogue attendance and other traditional forms of Jewish observance. What can be taken from this statement is that Jews are longing for something that offers a deeper meaning in their lives, to nourish their identities on their own terms because they feel their institutions are not doing exactly what they're supposed to do. There is, I believe, a uniquely conservative rationalization to this dilemma. This 67% of Jews knows that they do not have to go to synagogue and pray just because they're plainly commanded to by rabbinic authority. At the same time, that same group affirms that it is incumbent upon them to find meaning in their Judaism only through the parameters of Jewish thought and culture we have today. An example of what I mean by that is that all Jews would likely acknowledge that going to church on a Sunday morning does not substitute for Shabbat worship and observance. It's outside the Jewish framework. Jews are searching for meaning in Judaism, but are not finding it through the resources or options we have now. The question then becomes, what do Jewish institutions do? What does the conservative movement do? For the institutions of conservative Judaism to live into the next century, the question they all must try and answer is, how are we organized? Do our institutions like synagogues, day schools, youth groups, camps, seminaries, and the like inspire people to live Jewish lives both inside and outside of the institution? If so, what is it that ignites our Jewish spark to do so? In other words, how can we preserve our success as we change? As I hope to convey in this presentation tonight, the study of the Jewish middle, or those between Reform and Orthodox, is not so clear precisely because that the middle has always been defined by what it is not. Defining something without terms or by negating hardline stances is an onerous and complex task that has been lost within the conservative movement in recent years. At the core of this presentation is change and how Jewish tradition can be preserved yet grow and change with the Jewish people as time unfolds. We know that nearly all Jews are thoroughly immersed in the secular world and that they do not have lives that revolve around Jewish practice. At the same time, we know that the bulk of Jews want to connect to their heritage in some way. And we also know that now more than ever, people are searching for meaning in their lives as they navigate the challenges of the world. At the crossroads are the challenges of today, like instant gratification, increasing political division, and rote livelihoods, just to name a few. And a rich Jewish experience that retains halakhic rigor and a worldview inspired by Torah on the other hand. Interestingly, the conservative movement of the past stood at this intersection too, though how they chose to respond was different than in contemporary times. Conservative Judaism stands in the middle of these problems rather than trying to directly ground the middle with hardline stances saying X is what we believe. By shifting the attitude back to the peak of the movement in the 1950s and 1960s, which can be best categorized as a discourse between different Jewish ideas and modern problems, we can create a space which caters to both the religious who feel distanced from orthodoxy because of modernity, and the spark seekers who desperately want a rich Judaism within that modern context. Additionally, this model of both a conservative and reform, excuse me, there's an issue on my screen really quick. There you go. Yep, there we are. There's a theological revolution on the precipice of the conservative movement. As the next generation rises as the inheritors of the movement and tradition, fashioning it to the needs of the day, it is my thesis to you that if the conservative movement is to live and grow and be a relevant force for the next generation, it needs to present differently. To be clear, this does not imply radically changing the movement's once core values. Rather, it implies vocalizing the beauty that comes from plurality of practice and the benefits of changing Jewish tradition to serve God in the modern age. What do I mean by vocalizing plurality of practice? To best illustrate this, I want to dive into some communities that I believe fit within the spirit of conservative Judaism, yet are not a part of the United Synagogue for conservative Judaism. An example I want to start with in New York City is called B'nai Jeshurun, a congregation that was revitalized by Rabbi Marshall T. Meyer in the 1980s. He has made strides across Jewish denominations by pulling Jews in for musical services to guide them through the traditional prayers in spiritually compelling ways. The congregation, which does use musical instruments, a practice common in many conservative synagogues because of two principles called Hidur Mitzvah, making the mitzvah of davening beautiful, and Machshir Mitzvah, essentially arguing that playing instruments are supplementary tools and bringing one to feel something deep during the mitzvah. They, like other congregations, cite using instruments not necessarily doing malacha or work, which is prohibited on Shabbat, even if one accidentally breaks the string of a guitar and thinks about repairing it. Aside from the rationales for how they worship, I believe the congregation has a very special clergy model that conservative Judaism can benefit from. The congregation is led by two senior rabbis, one conservative and one reform. This leadership accurately represents the practices of their community, which is replete with Jews who feel both commanded to be on a path of more strict Jewish observance and involvement, as well as those who choose practices for what feels meaningful for them in that moment. The congregants are represented by different Jewish leaders that complement each other rather than compete, to bring more Jews in and honestly reflect the Jewish beliefs and practices of the community. Though they are theologically different, their community is compelling because despite that difference, they're still unified in serving God and perfecting the world in the name of God. Whatever Jewish differences the clergy or community do not inhibit their ability to see each other as vital players in the cosmic story of the people Israel. Turning to another success story that fits within the boundaries of the conservative movement, albeit not formally through USCJ, is Ikar in Los Angeles. Ikar is best known for their rabbi, Rabbi Sharon Brous, who was ranked by the Daily Beast as the most inspiring rabbi in America. The community can be characterized by their musical and lively services, with rabbis ranging across the spectrum from Reform to Orthodox. Like B'nai Jeshurun, despite the differences between those in the community, they still unite together over their shared mission. A fair critique of these success stories is that they come from larger Jewish cities, New York and Los Angeles. There are plenty of Jews to pull from to create these communities, not to mention that changing a congregation can be easier in these cities since there's so many other options for worship. If someone does not like the change, they can simply find a different community within the movement. This is not the case in smaller Jewish communities where change can radically disrupt the worshipers, as the current model caters to new seekers. Moreover, many communities do not have the funds to bring in musicians or congregants able and willing to play. These critiques are pervasive and valid. There is no easy answer. But it seems that if the conservative movement is to continue, change is necessary in whatever degree is possible. Whether that means adopting contemporary tunes or making sermons relevant, especially for younger Jews, initiating change is the means by which we can pave the path for the future generation of Jews. Preservation might be beneficial for the current or past generations, but building a Judaism for the future to inspire them is the only catalyst for Jewish continuity. It may seem counterintuitive to give a presentation on conservative Judaism only to tout non-denominationalism. However, looking to a chart from Rabbi Elliot Jor's book, Our Ancestors to Our Descendants, shows the different types of conservative Jews, yet illustrates how they all fit together within the same movement. For example, conservative Jews can affirm all of these things: that God's will was revealed at Sinai and was written down by human beings, which could explain the possible diverse biblical traditions, like, for example, the two versions of the flood story we have in Genesis. And they can also affirm that the Torah was divinely inspired and that the revelation of God's will is unfolding to this day. What I believe these different categories of conservative Jews suggest is that regardless of what one believes, there is space for every person within this framework. It is especially important to note the synonymous verbiage of Reconstructionist Judaism and conservative poor. You can probably see this on your screen right now. This is to say that conservative communities should be composed of all of these ideologies, since they represent the diverse and nuanced attitudes of the Jewish people. For all intents and purposes, this breakdown of theologies within the movement should better show what conservative Judaism is not as compared to what it is. After all, defining the movement based off all these contrasting theologies is broad and murky. That, though, is precisely what can save the movement. In fact, that's what allowed it to thrive before. Rabbi Neil Gilman, of blessed memory, in his book on conservative Judaism, paints a portrait of life for conservative Jews during the peak of the movement in the 1950s. The scene captures a community of Jews who are split between retaining the traditional aspects of Jewish practice, like the order of service, Hebrew as the language of prayer, and staples of the religious experience, from Shabbat candle lighting and dinner to fasting on Yom Kippur. This half was largely composed of the high influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe in the decades prior. The other people in this scene are those who desperately want to preserve, honor, and benefit from the religion which has sustained their immigrant forebears, while equally participating as Jews in the modern world. These competing visions for Judaism brewing within the early conservative movement are also brewing within Jewish communities around the world today. We know that Jews are searching for deeper meaning in their Judaism. And we know that this group refuses to sacrifice their secular lives. This conservative model has worked before, though it is struggling now. And the question becomes, how do we make the tikkun? How do we repair this situation to fit the new situation of American Jewry, just as previous authorities of the Rabbinical Assembly have adjusted their approaches in the past? I think it's important to highlight one stark distinction between the past and today. The question of what makes a person or a community conservative has been hardened and stuck in an outdated past. In other words, conservative Judaism is out of line from the original spirit which founded the movement. That meaning, it has not been updated as the doctrine asserts that it needs to be by the leading rabbis of every generation. The thriving congregations that function similarly to the doctrine of the movement have updated their worship in the 2020s from what existed 50, 70 years ago. This required them to expand and retain traditional Jewish practices, which make them distinct from Reform Judaism, yet still retaining their serious and strict approach to Jewish worship and living. Kal v'chomer, to expand these solutions of these particular synagogues to the larger movement, this requires the loosening of standards. Back to how the standards used to be, somewhere in the space between the not Reform, yet not Orthodox, between tradition and change. Nearly 60 years ago, Professor Gerson Cohen, who was eventually the chancellor of the flagship educational institute of the conservative movement, JTS, gave a commencement address at Hebrew Teachers College in Boston, which, while controversial at the time, was in the spirit of the movement's doctrine. Cohen stated, quote, "A frank appraisal of the periods in which Judaism flourished will indicate that not only did a certain amount of assimilation and acculturation not impede Jewish continuity and creativity, but in a profound sense, this assimilation and acculturation was a stimulus to original thinking and expression, a source of renewed vitality." Cohen debunks popular myths of the past, like that the Judaism of today was literally dropped by God from the heavens, and that deviating from the status quo would cause the destruction of Jewish life as we know it. Excuse me, 1 second. There we go. As if to say, adjusting Jewish law as time progresses marks a cosmic rupture in God's covenant with Israel. Jewish history shows us that we change, and that allows us to thrive and continue. Jewish history, narratives from our own Torah, show us that not only do times change, but people change, oscillating between different categories of life, longing for tradition and change, longing for the comfort of the secular world and the comfort of God. Take this drash on the name change of Jacob to Israel. While many probably know that Yaakov's name was eventually divinely changed to Yisrael after he wrestled with an angel in the night, what is probably less known is that once he became Yisrael, he still retained the name Yaakov. Yaakov, when translated, means crooked or perhaps imperfect. And Yisrael, when translated, comes out to upright or straight, like the word yashar. This blessing says, yes, you are both Jacob and Israel, Yaakov v'Yisrael. Part of you lives and has lived in different realities. You live an imperfect life, part of the modern world, and you also live and want to live close to God, as the Talmud says, that God is as close to your mouth as to your ear. Most Jews want to live in both, creating new spaces between the crooked and the straight, for the future can show that my generation can live in and wrestle with both realities too. Showing we are not perfect, yet we are split between two existences, still in 2020, will reel in the next generation as they see the middle can be a home for us all. The reason I fall in love with Judaism over and over again is because of its imagination, its ability to adjust based off different situations and times to preserve the fire from the torch passed down from every generation. There is, as Rabbi Ed Feinstein put it, a Jewish genius to surviving. Our people has seen bigger challenges. Take the destruction of the Second Temple. One afternoon in the summer of the year 70 Common Era, the house in which the Jewish people conceptualized God to dwell had been engulfed in flames. That language about God being imagined to dwell is not metaphorical. The Jews who made a pilgrimage to the Beit HaMikdash from the diaspora truly believed they were coming as close to God as humanly possible. The diaspora was a blot on the vibrancy of Jewish life. Many thought, better to live closer to Jerusalem if one must live in exile, for they can dwell closer to God. None of that mattered, though, when God's house, the Kadosh HaKadoshim, was gone. The room was gone. God was gone. They say you never know how good something was until it's gone. I want you to imagine how it must have felt, experiencing the change of God dwelling in an actual place, an accessible place, at least for the high priest, to disappearing from the human experience. It certainly worried the great rabbis of the time. Nevertheless, rather than say, we're doomed, all is lost, forget this whole Jewish thing, one great sage, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, pulled Judaism out from the ashes. Ben Zakkai reimagined Judaism so that it could survive in this new world. He centered this rebirth in a small town called Yavne, where he issued 9 takanot to remember and honor the system that had been destroyed. More powerfully, this system completely revamped Jewish life. Rather than dwell in some limestone building, God was present everywhere. The center was not God's actual house. Instead, the center became Torah and living out that Torah to actualize the presence of God. Instead of sacrifices to cater to the new generation of Jews, the rabbis of the first century developed rabbinic Judaism, what we practice today. A revitalized Judaism built on prayers, like various biblical characters would do, and deeds to litzarefet habriyot, to refine human character, would be the basis on which Judaism was built. Some of you might know the song. There's a beautiful tune by Rabbi Menachem Creditor, the son-in-law of Rabbi Shlomo Karlebach, called Olam Chesed Yibaneh. That phrase, which translates to "the world is built through acts of love," was derived from Ben Zakkai. Judaism moved to sometimes meaningful for the new. Judaism moved to something meaningful for the new time they were in. It preserved the spirit or the essence of the law, and that's a term I'll come back to later, all by balancing the old with their current reality. They were able to build an entire world on love. The destruction, which was called Korban, which really only refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, though some refer to it to the Holocaust as a Korban too, translates to catastrophe. Many Haredi communities, though they did not view the Enlightenment, Haskalah, as a Korban, they definitely thought it was a tragedy that would lead to the demise of the Jewish people. Ben Zakkai, like Solomon Schechter, the founder of Conservative Judaism, knew that Judaism does not have to be an island if it wants to survive. Judaism has always been interwoven with the larger world, and it is vibrant today because of those connections. Granted, these changes around temple worship were almost 2,000 years ago. However, I just mentioned a second ago that there's something called the spirit of the law. And that's a rather complicated term, since that argument has been made by other characters in history, like the Apostle Paul, to justify Christianity breaking with Judaism to serve God. To address this point, though, I want to echo an argument from Rabbi Zacharias Frankel, one of the other founders of Conservative Judaism. What he said in his Darchei HaMishnah, that Conservative Judaism is not necessarily abrogating the Sinaitic covenant, since it is still focused on the authority and the power of the deeds from that covenant. So in short, Judaism is fundamentally about how you live rather than plainly what you believe. Beyond this point, I want to underscore how compelling change is in Jewish history. Most critically, without the changes from the rabbis of the first century, nothing would have been able to survive. Had they not made those changes, we would lose the hundreds of commentaries on Torah that have flavored Jewish practice since exile. While I'm not justifying the destruction of Jerusalem, even though it was a broken society, the rabbis concede this, I do think that this destruction happened for a reason, to bring us closer to a holier, more perfect place. Drifting away from a religion for a second, change has led the Jewish people to make remarkable impacts on secular life. You probably know that though Jews make up less than 1% of the population, at least 20% of Nobel Prize winners are Jews. Lastly, without change in Judaism, Jews would not play such an active role in repairing the world, seeing that process as a holy partnership between God and human beings. Sometimes change, even if it is out of catastrophe, can have profoundly positive and transformative implications that make the world better than it was before. Again, to be clear, liberal Judaism was not a catastrophe. In fact, I believe quite the opposite after my study. It is a way to balance Jewish heritage with modern insights that can deepen one's relationship to the divine. I know that the will is there among my generation, among the extremely religious and the Jewish nuns, to find meaning in the Jewish past, to honor it, and build something new to continue the covenant in this complicated world. Ben Zakkai, Schechter, Cohen, Meyer, Krauss understood that to thrive like previous generations meant to embrace a dialogue between the world as it is and our aspirations. This rigidity is productive, not the fossilization of the past or a rejection of it. It is my fervent belief that this dichotomy best serves the Jewish people, the larger Jewish people, especially as there are those who feel that they are not comfortable on either extreme end. We talk so much about Jewish continuity, our concerns and visions for it. My question is, are we willing to expand the boundaries of the conservative movement to serve as a catch-all that can inspire young Jews, the future generation, to be Jewishly rigorous while retaining their modern 2022 selves? It's a question which can only be answered over time as our communities move forward and see the results of Jews connecting to their Judaism from across the spectrum. We are responsible for this Jewish future, though, and it is on all of us to take charge and save it. That, I believe, is the call of the hour. Thank you so much for attending my presentation tonight. I know it's a beautiful evening here in Omaha, and Zoom is not exactly the place everyone wants to be anymore. Nevertheless, it really means so much to have all these people from the very different parts of my life dropping in to listen to what I believe is a really pressing issue for American Jewry today, which requires action sooner rather than later. Very quickly, I want to give a few shout outs at this time. First, I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Jeannette Gabriel, the director of the Schwab Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. She's hiding over in that corner. Since I approached her to become involved in the Schwalb Center in early 2020, she's been dedicated to helping me succeed and allowing me to learn as much as possible. I do not think that the Schwalb Center could have lucked out more with her as director. She worked so hard to create Jewish education for the entire Omaha community. Lastly, I want to thank Nate and Hannah Schwab for creating this center in the first place. Although I'm nearly graduated from UNO, I know that the Schwab Institute will continue to help Jewish students like me who are seeking support in being Jewish on campus, as well as all the academic opportunities to dive into Jewish life, culture, and religion. So at this time, I want to turn it over to Dr. Gabriel for some final thoughts.
Okay, well, first of all, stay here, Tristan. First of all, I want to invite you to join me in congratulating Tristan on this incredible senior thesis that he delivered tonight. And to say that how wonderful it was to hear this presentation, that Tristan is really exemplifying the best possible model of a deep, thoughtful, compassionate inquiry, the way that he engages with the texts, produces his own incredibly thoughtful arguments, provides a complex analysis, and of course speaks so passionately about his work, is really moving. And I want to add that Tristan is part of a long legacy of important Jewish scholars who have come out of the Omaha Jewish community. So that's part of what we have done here in the out in the prairie of Omaha across time. So you're part of that continuation, and we're so excited to see what you're going to do next. We do have a few moments for some Q&A, and for those of you who have been asking online, Tristan's presentation will be available as a video on the Schwalb Center website. It will be also able to send out to all the participants the copies of the charts that he showed. And I want to mention again that he's doing a series of 3 lectures in the upcoming month, will be available on our website with a deep analysis of some of the study that he's done in our classes. So I'm going to turn it back over to Tristan to handle some Q&A and invite the audience to chime in with questions or thoughts.
Hello, good Yashiko Jade Rogers. You are me 66 years ago. And this is very emotional for me. The words you said. I put my heart and my life, as my friends Elliot and Richard, also one in Cleveland and one in Toronto. No, I'm turning 80 in a few weeks. I was on that first US-wide trip to Israel in the summer of 1958 when I turned 16. 100 American students and 3 Canadian. I grew up in the synagogue, which was the leading synagogue in the conservative movement, Bethel congregation in Toronto, with over 3,000 family units representing close to 8,000 people. This last Shabbat, by the way, when I peeked in there, it was in the chapel, not in the monstrous sanctuary that holds 3,500 people. And even in BJ in Houston, where our friend Brian Strauss was, the numbers were not great. Although I must say in Ozzie Schwartz and Rabbi Cosgrove, there was a large attendance at the park in Manhattan. But I know, as you can see, I know every one of these shuls because of COVID, because of Zoom. But I still long for being in my shul, which isn't Bethesdic anymore, for other reasons that I don't need to go into. We had once in Toronto 6 or 7 large conservative congregations, which reduced, well, we had about 15, and they were reduced by amalgamations of between one and another. Now we have a major amalgamation underway in Toronto, and we had at least, that's with the United Synagogue of America, which is now the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, and 6 more, or at least unaffiliated with the movement. So as you can see, I won't give the list of all of these shuls I attend. So what did my generation do wrong? That is why we're here tonight. I propose, and Dr. Gabriel might agree or not, that the beginning of where we are now was the opening the gate to that parking lot that was opened in the conservative movement caused the disaster that we see today. I still have the confidence that with young people like you, our future will be ensured with Hashem's blessing. I've said enough for now, Elliot maybe wants to say something. We have a Jewish think tank, which involves Cleveland, New York, the Carolinas, Ohio, Montreal, Toronto, all over the place with about 20 members. And this is one of our subjects that we are going to be addressing. It's very, very important to our hearts. Thank you for listening to me.
So much.
Yes, I wonder if I can add to what my dear friend Stephen Creed just said. I'm Elliot Zinner, Dr. Elliot Zinner in Cleveland, Ohio. And I got together with Stephen and Dr. Richard Pass, who probably is online now, to form this Jewish think tank. And we meet every Tuesday at 2 o'clock on WebEx, which is a site sponsored by my college. And I just wonder, Stephen, what do you think about inviting Tristan, if he'd like to join us on the 26th when we have Rabbi Tarkovsky, who is widely known in the conservative movement. He worked on the board that produced the Machzor, High Holiday Machzor, and the Daily Prayer Book, which I think is called Lev Shalom. Gee, it would be wonderful to have Rabbi Latovsky and Tristan on at the same time, an older generation rabbi who was formerly head of Hillel at the University of Wisconsin. He's kind of semi-retired now. And if we could have Tristan on with us, I think that would be great to have the older generation and Tristan upcoming, who's going to be somebody I think everybody who identifies with Judaism and in particular with the conservative movement can be proud of. I'm sure your parents and the university are very proud of you. What do you think of inviting Tristan? Perhaps you can tell us how to get in touch with you, and maybe you could join us by WebEx on the 26th at 2 o'clock. If you'd like to, I will discuss it with the other people who are helping me organize programs for our think tank. Tristan, would you like to join us on that date? And again, if so, I'll discuss it with Stephen and Richard and some of the other people who are working with me.
Well, first, thank you. That was so kind of you to extend the offer and all your words of praise. It's really overwhelming. Yeah, I think we have your registration information for this talk tonight. So after the talk is over, we can send you an email. That way you can be in touch with me, Dr. Gabriel, and then I would love to participate in that talk. I think it'd be really interesting.
Oh, that would be certainly gratifying to all of us. And I think you would appreciate Rabbi Latovsky. Perhaps Dr. Gabriel knows of him. Again, he was on the board that put together the High Holiday Machzor, the most recent one, and the prayer book. And they had to discuss which prayers to include, which prayers not to include. So he's going to speak with our group on the 26th about conservative Judaism and the beauty of it. And he also is informed about the Pew Foundation studies and some of the data that regrettably is not that encouraging.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing from you and Stephen is that you're asking, where did we go wrong? And I think that it's not necessarily where did you go wrong sort of in the past. The movement actually has a really promising framework. Really the call of the hour now is that the younger generation needs to step up and make decisions on Jewish law and practice and sort of expand in order to reach a lot of these, I called them Jewish nuns, the Pew called them Jewish nuns, in order to really create a space for everybody how it used to be. So the conservative movement just was responding differently over time. It just feels as though that recently it's not. It's responding to a different time. So if we can get back to the 2020s, then I think we would be in really good shape. And I think that requires rabbis who are on, they're part of the rabbinical assembly to ask some really challenging questions about going back to this ideology of ambiguity rather than having these hardline statements which turn a lot of people away. So I think that might be the mistake of the conservative movement. It's not anything that can't be repaired though.
Very good. And I wonder if Dr. Richard Pass, who's also one of my colleagues in the way up in Toronto, would you like to add anything to what Tristan said and what I said and what Stephen said?
Yes, Tristan, you said so much. I was taking some notes as fast as I could. Knowing that we can get your video and study it would be very, very important to us as we go forward. As what we're seeing here in Canada, we always have been a generation behind what is happening in the States happens in Canada. We're a little slower. We're a little more conservative, us Canadians, if you gather what I'm saying. And your vision is basically what our vision wants to be. And we thank you for those comments very much so. Well done.
Yes, Tristan, I was married to a beautiful Canadian who unfortunately Hashem took from me 8 years ago. And she often said that Canada was a generation behind where we were conservative Judaism-wise in the States. But when she said behind, she did not speak about diminish it in any way. She said just maybe slower to catch up. So she wasn't downing the Canadian version of conservative Judaism. So I guess what's very important now is for us to have contact information so you can contact us and we can contact you, and maybe Dr. Gabriel would like to be involved as well. So I mean,
thank you very much. It's great to have your input and comments, and we'll be sure to be in touch right away. We do have some time, a few moments for other comments or questions from audience members. I know there was quite a bit to unpack there, but if folks have specific points or even general questions, material that they want Tristan to expand on a little bit, please feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. Well, while people are thinking that over, Tristan, I'm happy to ask you to expound on a point or two. I'm really intrigued by this sort of murky space that you have discussed and really developed in your thought across time as a source of strength for the Jewish community. This is something that we've talked about quite a bit. The notion that we can sit with instability and that it can be something valuable, a space to sort of learn and grow from. I'm wondering if you can expound on a little bit how you see the conservative movement contributing to that in ways that other traditions have not.
I think that's a really good question, and I'm happy to talk a little bit about it. I think one of the really compelling things that the conservative movement can offer that other movements not that they necessarily can't, but you don't see it a lot, is the idea of plurality of practice that I talked about. Because we know that, like in theory, because Reform Judaism is entirely about choice, one could make every choice and fit within that framework. But I think sort of my response to that is you don't necessarily see that coming out of Reform synagogues. And it's not necessarily a welcoming place for those who are more conservative, more observant, whatever language you want to use. And I think that you go into a conservative synagogue, you can meet all types of people. You can meet somebody who's very Shomer Shabbat, very observant, perhaps more so than some of the clergy. And then you can also meet somebody who is not observant at all. And they're going to go out and do something very different than that guy after services. And I think it's really cool that you get to meet those very different types of Jews. It reflects the data that we see in the pew of each of these different groups. So I think the murky space kind of shows that Jews are constantly oscillating between these two ends of being religious and being secular, of wanting to do more and also wanting to be modern. So I think there's some God to be found within that murky, unclear space, because it creates room for a lot of different people.
Could I ask a quick question, Tristan? We all know that emotions drive behavior. I'm curious, when you think of conservative Judaism, would you share with us 2 or 3 of your emotions that you relate to it? I.e., what do you feel? A, B, C, D. Just curious about this.
Yeah, I think I feel, if I'm in a conservative synagogue, I feel a very strong sense of Ahavat Yisrael, of love of the Jewish people, because you get to see those different types of Jews. And I think I mentioned that in my last answer. I think, I mentioned Tradition and Change, which is a very popular book for conservative clergy to read when they go through seminary. And I think that's what you get a lot of in a conservative space. And I like that, conservative Judaism sits at the intersection of real life and, the highest Jewish values that we can possibly have. So a sense of pride, I guess. Yeah.
And it seems that you've talked a lot about tying this to the experience of the diaspora. I'm wondering if you wouldn't just say a few more things about how you see that connection to this type of practice as really rooted in the experiences of the diaspora.
Yeah, I think like when change was first happening in the conservative movement, a lot of it was to preserve the connection of those immigrant groups that were coming into America in the decades prior to the peak of the movement in the 50s. And I think now, you have people trying to figure out who they are, where their family history comes from. And a lot of that stems back to those experiences of those immigrants coming to America, them desperately trying to retain what made them distinct in the old country, their Jewishness, and also trying to, tackle the same challenges of the modern day by existing in real life. Does that answer your question?
It does. I would push you a little further to maybe even then go back to earlier experiences of the diaspora before the formation of conservative Judaism, as sort of how this is something we've talked a lot about in the classes, about how this is not an experience that just has happened now, but an experience that's happened across time for Jewish communities.
Right, and I think you can see that, the start of the diaspora, it was Babylonian exile, but I hopefully gave some visions of Roman exile and people trying to, cling to the Judaism that nourished their ancestors and trying to create something new, balance that between reality and, the Judaism that they love so dearly. So I think we face the same sort of challenges, although they're very different in kind. I'm sure that the rabbis of, first century Common Era Judea did not anticipate some of the challenges of intermarriage, and all that is very different.
Okay.
I'd like to, there's one question that was not even posed, and I find that it's very necessary to pose this question to both Dr. Gabriel and to our guest speaker. Now, this is the question of brick and mortar buildings. We've undergone a terrible 2 years. The Orthodox community has, for the most part, and Chabad, they had difficulties, but they definitely are both surviving, especially Chabad, as we know. In fact, maybe that's where our biggest strength is. Of course, I want Reform Judaism as well to survive, but the issue of brick and mortar buildings is addressed by many and it hasn't been discussed here tonight. In other words, in the large centers of Manhattan, Southeast Florida, Cleveland, where there's a number of, and Toronto, where there's a number of conservative synagogues, they all cannot survive in the large synagogues with 1,000 to 2,500 members, or 2,000. Sinai Temple maybe is under that, well, a bit. But BJ Houston is at 2,000 right now. So there will need to be amalgamations. And Rabbi Aubrey Glazer, who's a young rabbi, now he's 45 years old, he has a vision, and I'm not clear, I have to speak to him, he's a cousin of mine, of not a brick and mortar building in conservative Judaism for our survival. So what is your comment about that?
Well, I think when you had this large influx of immigrants coming to America, that was exactly what they wanted. I mean, in order to fit within the modern context, it meant replicating buildings which resembled their counterparts. So like churches, I mean, were ubiquitous really in the 1950s, which is like the peak religiosity of America as well. But I think now, one of the major shifts within my generation is that Judaism is moving away from those brick and mortar institutions and more into the natural world. And by that, I mean that people are more likely to probably go to services outside rather than in a building that they didn't create, that was created by their grandparents. And Judaism would, say that that's a more authentic way to connect to God. One of the reasons I actually learned from my teacher, Rabbi Stephen Abraham, that I just love is that you can't have a sanctuary without windows, according to Jewish law. That fundamentally your religion has to be connected to the broader world, to going out and doing something in the world. But it's also to know that God is not confined in that space and that there's more spirituality. There's more of you can get a deeper experience outside a building. I definitely believe that to be true.
Wonderful. Any last questions before we wrap up? Anyone who hasn't asked a question or made a comment would like to chime in?
I ask another quickie. Tristan, how would you compare, say, online services to on-site, at least? And I'm just wondering if there aren't a lot of people who initially were not exactly in favor of online services, who got used to them, and in the future would be less likely, apart from cost and building maintenance and so forth, would say, why do I have to schlep to a shul when I can just go on services online? Any comments about that? Two different modes of delivery, let's say.
It's a really challenging question because there's so many advantages and disadvantages to both. Because fundamentally, to be Jewish, you have to be part of a community, that you have to be involved, seeing the face of another person. And on the other hand, live stream services, whatever, has exposed so many Jews to the broader Jewish world that if you do live in a smaller community, you can get access to quality teachers that you otherwise wouldn't if you were only in person. So I don't know that it's a long-term solution to just have live stream and worship that way. I think fundamentally we have to, be in person and you need to be a part of a community. But definitely, having services up and recorded allows you to get more Torah if that's what you're looking for. So, it's a double-edged sword.
Well, in connection with those comments, I would say that the Schwalb Center is holding an in-person dinner on April 5th with Dr. Lior Sternfeld from the University of Pennsylvania here at the Jewish Community Center, and that we are planning a dinner for Tristan, a going away dinner before he heads out of the community, which I hope everybody will be able to join us in person. So these in-person gatherings are really critically important to sustaining the lifeblood of communities, especially smaller Jewish communities like ours. So I want to thank you all for joining us here tonight. And thank you in spending the time with Tristan and congratulating Tristan on his incredible scholarship and the bright future before him, and how proud we all are of what he has accomplished so far here in Omaha. And with that, we will say good night. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan.
Thank you.